Today we'll be going over the chapter 12 of the book Delivered into Covenant, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 2 by Walter Brueggemann. And today's chapter is entitled Yahweh in Full Disclosure. And the pivotal verses for consideration are found in the 34th chapter, verses 6 and 7. And they read, "The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children." In the last chapter, Yahweh was withholding when pressed by Moses about the depths of Yahweh's mercy. You remember they had blown it by making the golden calf, and they were in hot water, and Yahweh wanted to destroy the Israelites. And Moses argued with God and pleaded with God and petitioned God to show mercy. And so last week's pivotal verse was a very ambiguous and frustrating answer that Moses received as he was trying to scope out the depths of God's mercy. And it was the 19th verse of chapter 33. "I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." Now, the dialogue in chapter 34 carries on along similar themes. Moses continues to beseech Yahweh to relent in anger and to go out with the people. It's in verse 9. It is in this context that God gives a broad and sweeping testament to the mercy and grace of God, one that assures the reader or hearer that God's inclinations will ultimately and always bend toward mercy, grace, love, and faithfulness. Faithfulness and steadfast love here indicate a deep resolve to honor the covenant made between Yahweh and the people. I'll just read today's pivotal text one more time. "The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children." Of this passage, Brueggemann writes, verses 6 through 7, apparently on the lips of Yahweh, constitute a breathtaking disclosure of the character and inclination of Yahweh. This is the fullest disclosure of Yahweh in the Old Testament. I'm going to read that line again. This is the fullest disclosure of Yahweh in the Old Testament. It functions as a sort of credo that articulates a baseline from which many other disclosures in many other texts will subsequently emerge. It begins with the double utterance of the divine name. This is an extraordinary articulation, especially when we remember that the self-announcement of Yahweh in chapter 3, verse 14 was enigmatic concerning the divine name and did not want the name fully known. In chapter 33:19, however, Yahweh had promised Moses, "I will proclaim my name before you." And now here is that proclamation. Not only do we have a name, but long description of the nature of who Yahweh is. And the reason why Brueggemann says that this is the fullest disclosure of Yahweh in the Old Testament and calls this the baseline is because in other passages where God's actions may seem troubling or disconcerting or might raise even just simple curiosity, this verse is held up as the baseline, the core. Think the root of who God is flows from this passage. Here is an assurance that no matter what happens and no matter how angry Yahweh becomes in the future, God will be influenced by these core attributes, which are anchored in an abiding love that inclines God always and in every situation toward grace, mercy, and forgiveness. This is especially significant given that we've just been through the debacle of the golden calf. While the people will face consequences for their actions, the arc of God's actions will always yield towards forgiveness and restoration. Or as the text puts it, the Lord forgives iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clears the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children. So here is an image of a God who will allow the people to face consequences, sometimes dire, for their actions. but who will never abandon them over the course of time. Apparently, one needs a bird's eye view of history to better understand the scope of God's grace and mercy. But wait, there's more. God is also slow to anger. Here is not only a God who will let the anger cool, but who will be patient up until the moment that the anger boils over. I love how our English translations obscure a great pun in the Hebrew. The phrase slow to anger in Hebrew means long nose. And you would know that if you spoke the language, you'd hear this sort of clever joke written into the language. And why is this word also also mean long nose? Well, the imagery here is an anthropomorphized God breathing out fire from their nostrils, but the nose being exceedingly long gives the air time to cool before it reaches the nose tip. And the anger cools, and then grace and mercy are meted out because ultimately God's steadfast love endures forever, writes the psalmist in 136, or as our text puts it, again, keeps steadfast love for the 1,000th generation. That's what God does. And this is good news. But just after these reassurances, we are given a new assurance. God will not simply wipe the ledger clean, but there will also be a reckoning for our transgressions, real consequences for wrongful actions. Or as verse 7 puts it, by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And all I can say is, ain't it the truth? For we are forced to reckon with the sins of our grandparents. Think intergenerational conflicts, environmental devastation, domestic demons such as alcoholism or domestic abuse, patterns repeated, or if not repeated, the impacts are felt for generations to come. But God's steadfast love for the thousands of generations to come and God's continued faithfulness to the human race will continue to motivate God to strive with us toward our restoration and redemption. But in the meantime, Brueggemann writes, page 133 of the ebook, the positive assurance is for 1,000 generations, but the visitation of punishment is for only 3 or 4. The difference is important, but is not much comfort to those in the first 3 or 4 generations who know that after them there will be divine generosity, but not right now. And this begs a question that may be asked of anyone engaging this text. I extend the question to you and think of it internally for yourself for a moment. Are we living in the glow of the 1,000th generation to be blessed, or amidst the curse and consequences of the 3rd or 4th generation? Or, worse still, are we the first generation in the light of God's ire and judgment? To use the illustration Brueggemann used, we have the time zones of steadfast love and visiting iniquity. In which do you or we reside? In Exodus chapters 33 and 34, to this question that I just framed for us, Moses was not given a direct answer to these questions. To quote Brueggemann again, Yahweh is presented as having a rich and complex interior life that yields different responses in different contexts, the different responses sometimes seeming to be for no reason at all. And I inserted here last week's pivotal verse because it came to mind. I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. Going on with the quote. Thus, the negotiation between Yahweh and Moses in chapter 33, verses 12 through 23, ended without clear resolution, with some frustration for Moses. Here, we still do not know. We do not know if Yahweh's readiness to forgive will override the affront of the golden calf, or if a divine vindication of wrath will be forthcoming. We do not know, because the future is left in God's hands. End quote. I gotta say, theological traditions have maneuvered through the tension contained in this text in various ways through the centuries, the tension being, so God is, the arc of God's tendencies are pulled towards compassion and love and faithfulness with the people, but there are times and periods where our iniquity is allowed to be visited on us and we face consequences for our actions. And so how to hold these two seemingly different manifestations of God's interaction with humanity, how to resolve the tension. And one way of resolving the tension is to omit the part you don't like. If you want a God who only forgives, but who may not allow our iniquity to visit us, look no farther than Psalm 86. You can read it later on your own time. In that psalm, it draws heavily from the language and directly quotes from today's pivotal verse, but omits the parts that have to deal with the judgment or the negative consequences for iniquities. Or if you want a counterexample, see the modern prophet Nahum's screed, which was referenced in this chapter, which prefers to omit the grace and mercy and instead takes relish in the idea that God will by no means clear the guilty. I have this illustration here that I found online, quoting from the book of Nahum and also quoting from today's pivotal text in Exodus chapter 34. And what the author of Nahum wants to do is just really cling to that line that God will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. And if you read that text, that's the theme that's just echoed again and again and again. And so you have in these interpretations a removal of the balance between a God who is merciful and compassionate and whose faithfulness and love for us is unending, but who also at times allows our iniquities to play out into their consequences. It's the way I would frame it. And for me, the interpretive lens that I bring to these verses is both and. This is often my lens for lots of different conundrums and seeming contradictions, or what's the word I'm wanting here? Paradoxes. Both and. We live as those damaged by our own iniquity and transgressions. We live in the wake of our ancestors' sins even today, and yet there are positive choices that they made in the past that have redeeming effects that have carried over through the centuries. Our thousandth generations may well be blessed someday by our godly living in the here and now, but the inverse is also true. Example, efforts to end the slave trade in the 16th through 21st centuries will no doubt bless the human race for centuries to come, but the immediate effects of its cruelty are still with us today. Somehow, in this one example, we may well reasonably hope for blessings for 1,000 generations, whilst we still live in the shadow of the curse visited upon us as the children's children of Jim Crow era United States. And so I use that as an example to cite of how we have this both and living in real time, or we have great advancements and even people's lives who have been blessed by the efforts towards liberation and freedom, and in the name of God and in the name of love and in the name of justice. But we also have the effects that are visited on the third and fourth generations. And I wouldn't even stick hard and fast to that as a rule, maybe the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. It goes on and it goes on. And I feel like we're living in sort of a both and, where we are living in the blessings of the choices, in the wake of the blessings of the choices that our ancestors made for us, but also in the wake of the curse. So what time zone are we in? Are we in the era or time zone when God's grace, mercy, and faithfulness and love are readily obvious? Or are we in an era when our iniquities are visiting upon us in waves of consequences after consequence? And for me, as I've been saying, both are true. We are living in an era when the chickens are coming home to roost, as they say, or we're paying for consequences of actions, the actions of our past. And decades or centuries old iniquities are still being visited upon us. And yet we trust that the God whose love for us is steadfast and who is faithful to us will not leave us, even as our iniquities tear us apart. God is in it for the long haul. It's the long game that matters in the end. And here I feel compelled to quote one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s more memorable lines to conclude: "We shall overcome," quoting him here, "we shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Here is one way to say that there is a God who is a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation. We'll move to a time of questions or comments, but I just note that our next class will be on the 29th of September. Next week, I will be in the south side of Indy at a retreat at an abbey. But I will be available for phone call if there's an emergency. I'll have my phone on. I'm still considering myself on the clock, as it were, throughout the course of the week. I'm not taking the Sunday off or anything. And I've already started working on the sermon and whatnot. But before that, 2 weeks time, catch up if you're behind, and also read chapter 13, the work completed, the habitat prepared. Chapter 13. Now, bring us back.
Oh, we lost Nancy.
We lost Nancy. So we've shrunk in size.
Yes, we have.
Well, she probably had too much to handle. I admire her for the effort that she puts into to really to make it to all of these things.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not the best discusser of any of this in any way, shape, or form, but I'm in agreement with you about we're both here and there. I don't get into political discussions with very many people because most of the time they're very adversary. There's a hard line and there's no discussion. It's this way or not. But recently was in a discussion when somebody brought up wearing his Magna hat, and we had been discussing some other things. And I said, I do have some controversy with that because Make America Great Again assumes that we have always been great in all ways. We've been great at some things. We've been great, unfortunately, at war, but we've been great with industrialization and technology, and yet we're letting some of that go. We're great with manufacturing, and we've been letting some of that go. But when I brought up what we haven't been great at is with people. We have not been great at people, starting with the Indians. And immediately this person said, well, that's in the past.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, it is in the past. It was done in the past, but it's our history, and it has had ramifications on the Indians to this day. Children were taken out of their homes and put in Christian schools where they were sometimes abused. I mean, that's been brought to light recently.
Into the 20th century. That was
absolutely. And that has been just dissolved not that long ago.
I just listened to a news report where it was reflecting on some bad information, and the counter to the bad information was that there's a reality that to this day, Child Protective Services collect and take children from indigenous homes at disproportionately high rates than other homes because of this. For centuries, we've been doing this. And so those biases baked into these institutions kick in and are remove children from indigenous homes at higher rates than even other minority groups.
Well, and the idea, I think initially, maybe not consciously or whatever, was to erase the culture.
Yes.
Take the children away. They weren't learning the language. They weren't learning the traditions. They weren't having the wisdom of their elders. They weren't exposed to their religion.
There was a statement for that. Say, destroy the Indian, save the man. That's what they said. Mm-hmm. And the idea was there's Kelly. Say hi, Connie.
Hi, Kelly.
I'm here with Connie and Nancy.
Well, and then with slavery, we allowed it to happen. And then when we fought to free, then we instituted Jim Crow, which continued to keep people down. And it continues today with the disproportionate legal action. Mm-hmm. And we can talk about, our police force, and not that I think that all of our police are bad. I don't by any stretch of the imagination. And I think it's very small in number, but it's horrendous. It's, each individual act is horrendous.
And the institutions protect the those who do the bad things. The institutions give cover.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just been people. It's been generated. And Jews have been persecuted in the United States. Muslims have been persecuted in the United States. Asians now are being persecuted. They were initially, and now it's coming back around because of COVID and thinking that they all brought it to us. Just crazy stuff. It's crazy. And, I think that's scary when some people just think, oh, that's in the past. It's over and done with. And yes, it's in the past. We personally didn't have anything to do with it. We did not do it.
There's a book that I listened to an interview. I tend to buy the book. I'm going to find it's about forgiveness, and she's a rabbi. She's not a Christian. And she brings, she's a scholar of Judaism, of course, but also of Maimonides. If I'm saying that right, I may be saying that completely wrong. But she wrote this book on forgiveness, and one of the points that she makes is that in America, in the United States specifically, we have become our a distinctly Protestant theology around forgiveness has taken hold, which insists that forgiveness beyond restitution, beyond making recompense, beyond penance, and all of those things, the thing you move to quickly, almost immediately, is forgiveness. So you get to, what's the first thing you do when you do something wrong? You say, I'm sorry. And then if that prompts that I forgive you, we're done. Well,
like it never happened.
Yeah, that's baked into like Protestant Christianity. It's not a very scriptural approach to forgiveness. We're called to forgive, but the process is, when taken seriously, is so much more than getting that person to verbally tell you that they have just chosen to let it go. For one thing, what right have we to make those demands? And so she made forgiveness and restitution about the process for the individual who has done the wrong. So put the victim of what you've done at the center. Take yourself out of it, your feelings, your almost sometimes manic need to hear "I forgive you" and move back past it, and make good. And sometimes there's things you've done that are wrong that cannot be undone or even rectified. But then well, anyway, there's more to it. This is a long form interview. I'm going to look it up right now so that I don't leave this conversation without telling you the name of this author. But your conversation, Connie, reminded me of our collective, what we want, an intentional collective amnesia. Or not only events.
The thing that brought it to my mind first and foremost was when huge news about that's exactly what Russia is doing to Ukraine. They're bombing the museums, the cultural centers, their churches, doesn't matter the denomination, anything that is precious to them as a culture is being destroyed. And they're just, that's a different kind of war.
So this perspective that that today's pivotal verse gives us gives us a framework of talking about these things. You're talking with your friend who has different political beliefs and who is wanting to say, well, what about all the good? You can name that and say, thank God for the things that I wouldn't trade, that I'm so grateful for, about the place that I live, my country, my church, my faith, whatever is in discussion. But then also the ability to look around you and name the harm in real time, or even the lasting effects of harm in the past. You can have both of these things, these true things about our reality. You don't need to isolate one or the other. And I feel like in our political discourse specifically, that's lost, where you only hear, you only hear reports of our iniquity being visited upon us, and it is. Or you have a refusal to acknowledge any of that and only look at our identities, our important labels, our national identities, our faith labels, and other things.
That's very narrow too, because there's always the other side of the story. There's always the people that are on the other side of the fence that don't see it our way. They don't see, I mean, they may see some good, but they don't see it as all good the way some people do.
The author's name was Rabbi Danya, Danya Rutenberg, Ruttenberg, and I haven't read the book yet, but after hearing her talk, she seems like a really engaging person. Danya, maybe it's Danya, Danya Ruttenberg, and it's the title of the I don't know what the title of the book is. The book is called, it's Random House. It's a major publisher. Sorry for wasting your time while things load on my phone. On repentance and repair, making amends in an unapologetic world. And the interview title here is called Rabbi Dania Rittenberg on repentance and why forgiveness is overrated.
Okay.
She focuses the discussion on the repentance aspect and then leaves the forgiveness as the goal as another thing that the person that you're seeking forgiveness from, or actually not seeking forgiveness from as the ultimate goal, hope for forgiveness from. Possible, but that's entirely their journey with the hurt that you've done.
Mhm.
The other stuff is your work, and it's very helpful.
Well, and it's certainly, I mean, it's a problem with all countries. In listening to the news, I think it was this morning about the UK and losing their queen, and this one particular anchor person was talking about, a British one was talking about, they love their monarchy. That's, and she was describing how they pay into it, but how they're getting back because all of this land that the monarchy owns is paying people to work there. So it's giving them a livelihood. So, there's the good part of it. But then there was another person that chimed in and said, not everybody sees it that way. Not everybody sees it because that land that they have could have been owned by these people that are working there. Yes,
It could be public land outright.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So, that just seems to be popping up all over the place. Where people are finding where they live isn't all in a bubble where they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, don't sell yourself short, Connie. You had a lot of good things to say in reflections.
Well, thank you.
And Nancy's muted. I'm judging by your body language, Nancy, that you're dealing with quite a lot there on your end. So
I missed all the important part. I was very interested in this part about, forgiveness and visiting the inequity,
there are those
4 generations later, but I guess
I
was addressing that. I've just been in and out too much.
What I like about, and why you've heard me use the phrase "our iniquities visit upon us" multiple times, is that framing leaves this one of the things about this passage that is helpful is that it leaves a lot of room for interpretation depending on the time and context you're living in. And so when that was spoken, there's a good chance that many of the people hearing that believe that the iniquities being visited upon the people would be God's arm of judgment in some, apocalyptic way, meeting down vengeance on whatever wayward people was deserving of it. That probably would be the minds of the people hearing this, because that was their vision of God. That's how they believed that God worked. I don't share that conviction. But the way that it's framed, your iniquities visited upon us, leaves room to interpret that in a way that frames it as the consequences for the iniquities. That we have that God's commandments are not random. They will lead to life-giving ways, and when they're broken, things unravel. When you don't when you're not a good steward of creation, or a good neighbor, or a good partner with other humans in community, you pay for it. Everyone pays for it, and this passage leaves that interpretation a viable option. Not even shoehorning it fits within the world of the text as well. So that's why I'm careful in my framing there. Now, when Nahum uses it, I referenced Nahum. Maybe you weren't in here, Nancy, when I did the minor prophet Nahum. Nahum uses it entirely as judgment and vindictive action against a people that deserve it on God's part. That's the way that prophet sees the world.
I tend to think too that sometimes the writers, we've talked about writing in the context of the time, the time frame that they're living in, and some of it to put fear into people, like the iniquities of the parents passed down to the children. I mean, that's to scare you into hopefully doing the right thing.
Even in this text here, we have a clue about the kind of God images floating around the area, where you have that. I emphasize the anthropomorphication. If I'm saying that right, of God. described as having a long nose, or the anger, using describe the anger that doesn't burn long. And in the Hebrew, it's a pun that uses linguistic links to long nose. And I described the process of this idea that the God would be so mad that God would breathe fire, but God's nose is so long that by the time it gets to the end, it's cool. It's cute. It's cute. It's not meant to be literal, but it was believed at that time that was questions about whether God was the kind of God that would walk around and tramps around the land like God in the Garden of Genesis, or the God that knocked over the idols in the temple. I forget what, maybe Second Kings or something. Real kind of, God we think of like the Greek God sense, that's something people believed was plausible. And so that's,
well, I think that the scare tactic has been there in religion for centuries, like the fire and brimstone preaching. And,
we lose when Jesus warned of the eternal fire. There was, you've probably heard this before, but there was not within Judaism a doctrine of heaven or hell until they were influenced by Persian religion, the Zoroastrian religion, which had this dualistic view, and there was a heaven and a hell, and you try to attain degrees of perfection, or you may regrettably degrees of degradation and go to hell and burn. And anyway, that was sort of like, for centuries had been, in the ether. And so Judaism would draw from that, and Christianity would draw from that, and the metaphor of fire. And Jesus would use that to describe the consequences for sin, specifically greed and not welcome. Oftentimes he uses those metaphors to describe what happens to the rich young ruler, the rich man in the barns, and different things like that. And outside of the word used is Gehenna, which was a reference to a burning pile of trash that was outside the city, where people would throw their junk, and it would just sort of simmer in a sort of low burn all the time, and it was a really dirty place. And he would use that as an analogy for the way that how death dealing ways lead to life that stinks like that is painful like that is miserable like that.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And it wasn't meant to describe the punishment so much as the consequence, which is an important distinction, because when somebody makes their bed and lies in it, we may have pity or empathy, but we also understand that that's what's going to happen. So I tell Abel, don't run on the couch. He keeps running. He falls. He hits his head. Happened a month ago. I felt bad for the guy, but I also felt like, that was kind of what your hellfire for the moment is this cut on your face and the misery of the experience. And, we'll try to work through that. But the way that we've come to talk about it in fear is as a leverage of fear is not the consequence of sin, but God's hot anger and retribution, which gives us a picture of a God that is less caring and compassionate than most humans.
Right.
And so I'm one of those ones who's wanting to hold on to the metaphor and the language, because sin really does lead to destruction. And if humans live forever, how our lives have been shaped in this plane will certainly impact our experience of the next one. I'm a universalist in that I hope for and believe that God can eventually pull off the whole shebang and redeem and restore all that's possible. And I hope that all is possible. So I hope that God's reach is so far that even the people who you feel are irreachable, God can get to at some point. But that's a hope. That's a faith claim and a hope that isn't, and that's one that's reflected in the scriptures and the Christian traditions, but is not the only one. And the dominant ones recently have been opposite. It's your basic Protestant theology of kind of born again evangelical theology is just sort of everywhere now.
Yep. That's the person I was having the conversation with. That event, which I generally, when we're in a group and they start talking politics, I say nothing. And I just say, can't we talk about something else? Because you're not changing each other's minds. And all you're doing is, just supporting your own view.
And that kind of political branding is like wearing it very much on your sleeve. I mean, the thing about like hats like that or shirts is when somebody walks up to you wearing one like that, I mean, they want you to know where they're coming from.
Oh, of course they do. Of course they do.
Really upfront. It feels confrontational from my experience. That's because if I were doing that, if I were putting on a loud shirt that was meant to, that I wanted people to read and have a reaction to, or at least some thoughts about, that would be me making an important point to me. And because because there are things that are that important, but I don't see much value in forcing those things in that way. I just don't wear that kind of stuff.
I think it throws a wall up immediately to any kind of conversation. There's
a reason why you don't see me wearing really any kind of designation to indicate I'm clergy. It's the same reason. I want people to develop a levels of trust around me first.
Sure.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I couldn't walk in the classroom and pretend not to be a teacher, but
I can't walk into the church and pretend I'm not the pastor. Eventually it catches up to you, but yeah.
No, I totally agree with that. I think that, it sends a message that pretty much stops conversation from ever even starting.
Yep.
Unless you're talking to somebody who 100% totally agrees with you and they're going to agree with you.
And that's just good fun. That just makes you feel good. Well, thank you, Connie.
Well, thank you for doing this. Not feeling well.
I'm feeling better now than when we started. It goes in waves. I feel better now than when I did 30 minutes ago. This is the way it's been. I think I'm on the uptick.
Super.
But I'll upload this for everybody else, and I'll see you on Saturday. See you on Saturday.
Yep. We'll be there. Okay. Bye-bye.